My stepmother hid my late mother's letters for years, so I read them aloud at the family reunion. When I confronted her, she smirked and said, "You really think these are worth anything?" I just stared at her. That was 2 months ago. Yesterday, she called me crying, begging me to return the letters. My stepmother spent years erasing my late mom from my life and hid the letters she wrote for me before she died. So I read them aloud at the family reunion. Growing up with my stepmother was like living in a constant storm. She married my dad when I was 9, just a year after my mom passed away. I was still raw with grief, clinging to every memory of my mom, but my stepmother made it clear from the start that she didn't want my mom mentioned in the house. When I'd bring up a memory, something as small as, "Mom used to make the best pancakes," she'd roll her eyes and say, "Well, she's not here anymore, is she? Time to move on." If I cried, she'd sigh and mutter, "You're too sensitive. No wonder you have no friends." She also had this habit of losing my things. A hair clip my mom gave me, gone. A scarf my mom knitted. Oh, it was old, so I threw it out. My dad was often away for work, so I had no one to really defend me, and she knew it. She'd smile sweetly in front of him, but turn cold the moment he left. By the time I was 13, I learned to hide anything that reminded me of my mom. I kept a small box under my bed with photos, a necklace, and a few letters my mom had written to me before she passed. I never told my stepmother about the letters, but somehow she found out. One afternoon, I came home from school and went to check my box. The letters were gone. I tore apart my room looking for them. My stepmother appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, and said with a smirk, "If you're looking for those depressing old letters, I put them away. They're not good for you. Living in the past will keep you from having a future." I begged her to give them back. She just shrugged and said, "You'll thank me one day. You don't need reminders of her." From that day on, I avoided bringing up my mom around her, but little things kept happening. She'd forget to tell me when relatives called, or conveniently misplace cards sent by my mom's side of the family. She even told my younger half-brother, "You're lucky I'm your real mom. You don't have to grow up like her." Always sad and weird. Years passed, and I eventually moved out for college. My relationship with her remained distant, but I always wondered what happened to those letters. Whenever I asked, she'd brush me off with, "Why can't you just let it go?" Last year, my dad's health started declining, and we planned a big family reunion so everyone could see him. It was the first time in years that my mom's side and my stepmother's side would all be in the same room. A week before the reunion, I was visiting my dad's house when he asked me to grab something from the attic. While I was digging through old boxes, I found a small tin tucked under a blanket. Inside were the letters, every single one my mom had written to me. Some were short notes she'd left in my lunchbox. Others were longer, written when she was in the hospital. One said, "When you're sad, remember you were my joy every single day." I just sat there crying for a long time, and then I got angry that my stepmother had stolen these from me, hidden them, and kept me from them for over a decade. I decided right then how I was going to handle it. At the reunion, we had about 40 people there, my dad's family, my mom's family, and even a few family friends. Everyone was eating and chatting in the backyard when I stood up and said, "I found something in the attic that belongs to me, and I want to share it with everyone." I pulled out the letters and started reading them aloud. The first one was a sweet note from my mom saying how proud she was of me for learning to ride a bike. The second talked about how she hoped I would always follow my heart. By the third letter, people were crying. My dad had tears running down his face. My mom's sisters were holding hands, shaking their heads in disbelief. And then I read one that hit hard. "If I'm not there to watch you grow up, I hope you'll always keep my words close to you." I paused, looked directly at my stepmother, and said, "I would have, if they hadn't been hidden from me." The whole place went silent. My stepmother's face went pale, then red. She stammered, "I never," but my dad cut her off, asking, "You knew she had these letters?" She tried to play it off. "I was just protecting her from dwelling on the past. It was for her own good." I laughed, loud and bitter. "For my own good? You made me believe they were gone forever. You decided what I could remember about my own mother. That wasn't protecting me. That was cruelty." People started murmuring, some shaking their heads at her. My mom's oldest sister said, "How could you keep something like that from a child who lost her mother?" My stepmother's defense got weaker. I didn't think it was a big deal. At that point, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, muttering something about being ganged up on. My dad didn't follow her. In fact, later that night, he apologized to me for not noticing sooner and said she'd be staying with her sister until things get figured out. As for my stepmother, word about what she did spread fast among relatives, and let's just say she's been uninvited from more than a few family events. She wanted to erase my mom from my life. Instead, she made sure everyone would remember her. I kept the letters in a locked box and read them whenever I missed my mom. Last week, I came home to find the lock broken. The letters were in the sink, cut into tiny pieces. My hands went numb as I stared at the soggy mess of paper floating in the water like some sick confetti. I grabbed a strainer from the drawer and started scooping out pieces, my fingers shaking so bad I could barely hold it steady. The ink was already bleeding, turning the water gray, but I kept fishing out scraps and laying them on paper towels. One piece still had part of a word visible, "Love you all," before the rest dissolved into nothing. I tried pressing the wet pieces together, matching edges like the world's saddest puzzle, but they just fell apart in my hands. The kitchen floor got covered with paper towels as I spread out every single scrap, kneeling there trying to save something, anything. Daniel found me an hour later, still on my knees surrounded by wet paper, mascara streaking down my face. He pulled me up and held me while I sobbed into his shirt, then helped me photograph every ruined piece with his phone. The next morning, Grace showed up after Daniel called her, carrying her work camera and a box of evidence bags. She took pictures of everything, the broken lock, the sink, each destroyed fragment, while I explained how I'd found the letters in Dad's attic just last week. She documented every detail in her notebook, measuring the lock damage, bagging the metal pieces. We sat at my kitchen table sorting through the wet scraps when she said quietly that this was criminal destruction of property. Later that morning, I went upstairs to my old bedroom while Grace made phone calls downstairs. Marcus had taken over the room years ago, but you could still see faint rectangles on the walls where Mom's pictures used to hang. I remembered being 10 and watching Victoria paint over those marks with thick white paint. 2 hours later, we heard a car pull up and Victoria walked in with Robert, who was dragging his oxygen tank behind him. She announced she was there to get some of her things like she still lived here. When she saw the camera and evidence bags on the table, her face went hard. Robert wouldn't look at me, just stared at the floor while she said I was being being dramatic again, and they were just old papers. Daniel stepped between us when she moved toward the table, telling her that breaking and entering was a crime, and so was destroying someone else's property. She laughed, that same dismissive sound from my childhood, and said we couldn't prove she was here, or that those papers were even real. That evening I lay in bed trying to remember every word my mother had written, repeating them in my head over and over. A car drove slowly past the house, the third time in 2 hours, its headlights sweeping across the bedroom wall. Daniel got up to check the windows, adjusting the blinds like he was just letting in air, but I saw him checking the locks too. The next day, Aunt Caroline called from Phoenix, her voice shaking with rage after hearing what happened. She told me Mom had written more than just those letters, that she'd kept journals, and Caroline had them all. My heart stopped as she explained she'd been saving them for the right time. That afternoon, Marcus texted me for the first time ever about Victoria's behavior, saying she was acting weird and had been shredding papers all morning. He said he was scared she might do something worse. 3 days later, I went to the police station and filed a report with Officer Janet Mills, who took my statement with professional detachment until I mentioned the family reunion. Her whole attitude changed when she realized I was the letter girl, saying her cousin had been there and everyone was still talking about what Victoria did. Grace came with me the next day to install security cameras at my house, drilling holes and running wires while she mentioned something important. She still had her practice notes from when I was her client in college, years of documented emotional abuse that could be relevant now. 4 days later, I was at the grocery store picking up milk when I ended up in the greeting card aisle and froze completely. Mother's Day cards were everywhere, pink and purple and covered with flowers, and my chest got so tight I couldn't breathe. My hands started shaking and I dropped my basket, oranges rolling across the floor, and this old lady came over and just put her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything, just stood there with me while I tried to get air into my lungs, and after maybe 5 minutes, she squeezed my shoulder and walked away without a word. The next morning, I woke up to my phone going crazy with notifications because Victoria had posted on Facebook about me having mental health issues and needing prayers for my healing. How did she even get into the house to destroy those letters? I'm trying to understand the timeline here. She found them at her dad's place during the reunion, but now they're destroyed at her own home? Within an hour, she had 40 people commenting about how hard it must be for her dealing with my problems, and I took screenshots of everything before she could delete it later. Rebecca called me that afternoon so mad she was practically yelling, telling me she was done staying quiet because her dad had told her Victoria was spreading lies at church about me having a breakdown at the reunion. Robert finally called me the day after that, and I could hear him wheezing through the phone when he started talking about my mom's things, saying Victoria didn't just hide the letters, but then he hung up before he could finish. Daniel's mother showed up at our house the next morning with her phone, showing me videos she'd taken at the reunion of my whole speech, and Victoria's face getting redder and redder, saying this might help if I needed proof of what really happened. 3 days later, Victoria showed up at my office building during lunch, screaming in the lobby that I was trying to destroy her marriage, and security had to drag her out while 20 of my coworkers watched and my supervisor wrote everything down for HR. That night, I couldn't sleep, and at 3 in the morning, I found Daniel sitting in our dark living room holding a baseball bat, pointing at the motion sensor lights going off in our backyard, both of us staying awake until sunrise watching the windows. Marcus texted me to meet him at a coffee shop downtown the next day, and when I got there, he slid his phone across the table showing me pictures he'd taken of Victoria's car trunk, full of my mom's jewelry box, her wedding album, and even the perfume bottle she used to keep on her dresser. The day after that, I drove to the cemetery for the first time since finding the letters and sat by my mom's headstone for 2 hours, telling her everything that had happened while the groundskeeper pretended not to see me crying. Aunt Caroline showed up from Phoenix the next morning with 2 cardboard boxes that she said she'd been keeping for years, and inside were all these journals my mom had written during her last year, including one entry that said if something happened to her, she prayed Robert would protect me from Victoria's jealousy. Caroline and I sat on my living room floor surrounded by notebooks filled with my mom's neat handwriting. We spent the whole afternoon going through them page by page. My mom had written about Victoria from the very beginning, how she'd shown up at the coffee shop where my dad went every morning. The entries got darker as time went on. She wrote about finding her wedding photos torn up in the trash, Victoria claiming the dog must have gotten them. She documented Victoria calling me Robert's first mistake when she thought no one was listening. The worst entry was from 2 weeks before she died, describing how Victoria would lean over my bed at night and whisper that I wasn't hers. Caroline's hands shook as she turned the pages. She kept wiping her eyes and squeezing my shoulder. We found receipts my mom had saved, bills Victoria had hidden, even a note from my teacher asking why I'd stopped bringing lunch money. Everything was dated and organized like evidence. 3 days later, I brought the journals to Grace's office where she worked as a counselor. She read through them professionally, taking notes on a yellow pad. After 2 hours, she set them down and looked at me seriously. She said my mom was documenting abuse, that these read like someone preparing for a custody battle. We sat there in her small office with the afternoon sun coming through the blinds, neither of us saying anything for a long time. The next morning, Robert called Victoria into the living room to confront her about the journals. I could hear them arguing from upstairs, his voice getting louder and louder. Then I heard a crash and Victoria screaming. I ran downstairs to find Robert on the floor clutching his chest. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, he grabbed my hand so tight it hurt. His lips were blue, but he managed to whisper about the attic, that there was more up there she didn't know about. Victoria climbed into the ambulance playing the worried wife, telling the paramedics about his heart medication. The moment the ambulance left, Marcus showed up and we went straight to the attic. We pulled apart boxes and moved old furniture, checking every corner. Behind some pink insulation stuffed in the wall, Marcus found a plastic storage box wrapped in garbage bags. Inside were my parents' love letters tied with ribbon, my baby book with all my first milestones, and a VHS tape labeled Emma's First Christmas 1995. Everything Victoria had told us was destroyed in a basement flood 10 years ago. Marcus helped me carry it all to my car while checking the street for Victoria's car. That night, I sat alone in my dark apartment and put the tape in my old VCR player. My mom's voice filled the room as she narrated me opening presents, her laugh echoing when I tried to eat the wrapping paper. She picked me up and faced the camera, saying someday I'd understand how much I was loved. I rewound it and watched again, then again. I watched it 17 times until I had memorized every word, every laugh, every moment of her holding me. The next afternoon, Victoria came home from the hospital and immediately noticed things were moved in the attic. Within an hour, she'd called the police claiming I'd robbed her while she was with my dying father. Officer Janet Mills showed up at my door looking tired and annoyed. Victoria had given her a whole list of stolen items including jewelry and cash. I showed Janet the box with everything clearly labeled in my mom's handwriting, the baby book with my name on every page. Janet looked at the evidence, then at Victoria, and said she wasn't filing any charges for someone reclaiming their own property. Victoria's face turned purple, but she couldn't argue with a cop. That evening, Rebecca started a family group chat without Victoria and began sharing her own memories of my mom. She posted a photo from my second birthday that Victoria had said was lost. Then Caroline added pictures from my parents' wedding. Within hours, cousins and aunts were contributing their own photos and stories, things Victoria had convinced them were gone forever. Everyone had been told the same lies about floods and fires and accidents. The digital resurrection of my mom was happening in real time on our phones. I tried going back to work but couldn't focus on anything. Every email notification made me jump, thinking it was Victoria's lawyer. Every phone call could be about Robert's condition. My supervisor Karen found me crying in the bathroom and suggested I take medical leave. I told her I couldn't afford to lose my job, not now when everything was falling apart. She let me work from home, but I still couldn't concentrate. 2 days later, Victoria filed a restraining order against me claiming harassment and theft. The court date was set for 2 weeks away. She also convinced Robert while he was on heavy medication to sign power of attorney over to her. Marcus called me crying when he found out, saying she wouldn't let him visit anymore. Grace immediately connected me with a family law attorney named Diane Foster, who agreed to take my case for free after hearing the whole story. Diane reviewed all the evidence in her downtown office, spreading the journals across her conference table. She explained that Victoria was trying to establish a pattern of me being unstable and dangerous. She said we needed to document everything from now on. Every text, every call, every interaction. 3 days later, I was at home sorting through copies of the evidence when my phone rang, and Marcus's name lit up the screen. His voice broke as soon as I answered, and I could hear him trying to catch his breath between sobs. He told me Victoria had given him an ultimatum that morning, either cut me off completely or lose his college funding and housing. He kept saying he didn't know what to do, that he still had 2 years left of school and no way to pay for it on his own. I sat there holding the phone, listening to my little brother fall apart, knowing Victoria had planned this perfectly. The next day, Daniel's mother called me with news that she'd been organizing the relatives who'd witnessed the reunion. She'd gotten 12 people to write detailed statements about what they'd seen and heard that day, creating a paper trail that Diane said would be crucial for our case. Each statement described Victoria's behavior, her attempts to control the narrative, and most importantly, her admission about hiding the letters. That evening, I was checking my email when I noticed a notification from my mom's memorial Facebook page. Someone had deleted half the photos and removed dozens of posts people had written over the years. My hands shook as I scrolled through what was left, seeing gaps where memories used to be. When I called Facebook support, they told me only the page administrator could make those changes, and somehow Victoria had gotten herself listed as the primary admin years ago. The representative said there was nothing they could do without a court order. 2 days passed before I found myself sitting in my car outside the hospital where my dad was still recovering. The security guard at the entrance had my photo on a list Victoria had given them, claiming I was dangerous and shouldn't be allowed near my dad. I watched other families walking in and out, carrying flowers and balloons, living their normal lives while I couldn't even visit my own father. Rebecca texted me that he'd been asking for me, confused about why I hadn't come to see him. The next morning, Aunt Caroline drove to the hospital with 3 of her friends as witnesses. She walked right up to Victoria in the lobby and said loudly enough for everyone to hear that she was a thief and a liar who'd stolen from a grieving child. The way Marcus found that hidden box behind the insulation makes me wonder how long Robert had been planning this secret spot. Did he know Victoria would destroy things and prepare ahead? Victoria's face went red as she called for security, but Caroline had already turned and walked out. 3 visitors recorded the whole thing on their phones, and by that afternoon, the video was spreading through our extended family's group chats. Rebecca showed up at my apartment the following day with a small USB drive hidden in her pocket. She said Marcus had given it to her before Victoria took his phone away, and when I plugged it in, I found 6 audio files. Each one was a recording Marcus had made secretly over the past few weeks, including one where Victoria laughed about my reaction to finding the destroyed letters and said she'd done it for my own good. In another recording, she admitted to accessing my mom's Facebook page and said she was just cleaning up old junk that nobody needed to see anymore. The cease and desist letter arrived by certified mail the next morning, printed on expensive legal letterhead and demanding I return what they called stolen family property. They wanted $10,000 in damages for defamation and emotional distress caused by my malicious actions at the reunion. Diane actually laughed when she read it in her office that afternoon. She pointed to one paragraph where Victoria's lawyer had written that his client had disposed of the letters in the past for the well-being of the family. She said Victoria had just given us written proof that she'd destroyed my property. 2 days later, my dad was finally released from the hospital, but instead of going home with Victoria, he had Rebecca pick him up. He told Victoria he needed time to think about everything that had happened. She stood in the hospital lobby screaming that I'd poisoned him against her, but he just walked away with Rebecca supporting his arm. The nurses at the desk pretended not to notice, but I saw one of them recording on her phone. That night, I had the dream again, the one where my mom was trying to tell me something important, but I couldn't hear her voice. Victoria's laughter kept getting louder and louder until it drowned everything else out. I woke up gasping for air at 4 in the morning with Daniel holding me, telling me it was just a nightmare, but we both knew it wasn't just a dream anymore. The restraining order hearing finally came 3 days later at the county courthouse. Diane brought everything we'd collected, including the reunion video, Marcus's recordings, and signed statements from 14 witnesses. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair, listened to each piece of evidence without expression. When Victoria's lawyer tried to argue that I was harassing his client, Diane played the recording where Victoria admitted to destroying the letters. The judge's face changed then. Her her jaw tightening as she listened to Victoria laugh about keeping a child from her dead mother's words. After 40 minutes of testimony, the judge not only denied Victoria's restraining order request, but warned her about the consequences of filing false police reports and making fraudulent legal claims. Victoria jumped up from her chair and started screaming that the whole system was rigged against her, that everyone was conspiring to destroy her family. The bailiff stepped forward, but she was already storming toward the door, her lawyer hurrying after her, trying to quiet her down. Diane gathered our papers calmly while Victoria's shouts echoed down the courthouse hallway. 3 weeks after the courthouse mess, Robert called and asked if I could meet him at Rebecca's house without telling anyone else. When I got there, he was sitting in Rebecca's living room with his oxygen tank beside him, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He reached into his jacket pocket with shaking hands and pulled out a small brass key. He set it on the coffee table between us and said my mother had opened a safety deposit box before she died that Victoria never knew about, that he'd been too weak and scared to give it to me before. The next morning, Rebecca drove us to the bank downtown where the box had been sitting untouched for 19 years. The bank manager led us to a small private room and brought in the metal box, leaving us alone with it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the lock. Inside was my mother's engagement ring wrapped in tissue paper, a leather diary filled with her handwriting from when she was pregnant with me, and a sealed envelope that said, "To Emma on her wedding day," in her careful script. I grabbed all 3 items and held them against my chest like they might disappear if I let go. Rebecca had tears streaming down her face as she helped me put everything in my bag. We were at the bank for maybe 40 minutes total. When we got back to Rebecca's house, the front door was hanging open and we could hear crashing sounds from inside. Rebecca grabbed my arm and pulled me back to the car while calling 911. The police showed up within minutes and went inside with their hands on their weapons. They brought Victoria out in handcuffs, her hair wild and her clothes covered in dust from crawling through Rebecca's attic. The security footage later showed everything. Victoria using a crowbar on the back door, tearing through every drawer and cabinet looking for something, finding Robert's medications in the bathroom and dumping them all down the toilet in a rage, then trying to break into Rebecca's locked filing cabinet where she kept family documents. The next day, Officer Janet Mitchell came to take our statements and arrested Victoria for breaking and entering, destruction of property, and tampering with prescription medications. Robert watched from Rebecca's front window as they put Victoria in the police car, his oxygen mask fogging up with his tears, his hand pressed against the glass. The house felt completely different over the next few days without Victoria's constant presence and threats. Robert and I spent hours organizing his medications into a new pill organizer, both of us moving around each other carefully like we were learning to exist in the space she'd left behind. Neither of us said her name out loud. We just worked in silence, sorting pills and checking expiration dates. Marcus showed up at Rebecca's house 2 days later with his laptop and asked to speak with the detective handling the case. His hands were shaking as he opened his phone and showed Officer Mitchell years of text messages from his mother, where she'd written detailed plans about erasing my mother from history, about making sure I never found anything that belonged to her, about how she was going to make Robert forget his first wife ever existed. He had to stop reading several times to wipe his eyes. The next day, Grace cleared her schedule and met me for an emergency therapy session at her office. She listened to everything that had happened and then looked me straight in the eye and told me I wasn't crazy, that I'd survived psychological warfare, that my reactions were completely normal for someone who'd been systematically abused for years. I broke down crying for the first time since finding the letters in the sink, sobbing so hard I couldn't catch my breath. 3 days after that, the district attorney's office called to say they were adding stalking charges to Victoria's case and recommending she undergo a full psychological evaluation. Her lawyer tried to argue she was just under stress from family issues, but the prosecutor had pages of evidence showing a clear pattern of harassment and abuse spanning almost 2 decades. Daniel came over that evening and we sat on Rebecca's back porch looking at real estate listings on his tablet, talking about maybe moving to Portland or Denver, somewhere far from all of this. We both knew we couldn't actually leave until the legal stuff was resolved, but it felt good to imagine a fresh start somewhere new. We looked at little houses with gardens and spare bedrooms, carefully not mentioning Victoria's name even once. 2 days later, a rental car pulled up outside Rebecca's house, and a woman who looked just like an older version of Victoria got out. This was Ellen, Victoria's sister from California, who'd flown in to support her sister and figure out what was going on. Rebecca let her in and showed her all the evidence, the destroyed letters, the security footage, the text messages from Marcus, the police reports. Ellen's face went white as she read through everything. Then she sat down hard on the couch and said Victoria had done the exact same thing to their mother 20 years ago, isolated her from friends, destroyed her belongings, convinced everyone she was going senile when she tried to complain about things going missing. Ellen pulled out her phone and showed us pictures from their childhood. Victoria with scissors in hand standing over a pile of cut-up family photos, their mother crying in the background. She had more photos of burned books, smashed heirlooms, and Victoria's handwriting on a list titled Things to Get Rid Of, with their grandmother's jewelry box crossed off. Rebecca took photos of everything, while Ellen explained how Victoria had convinced their whole family their mother was losing her mind, when really Victoria was destroying everything and gaslighting her. 2 days later, Robert went to the courthouse and filed divorce papers, listing emotional abuse, destruction of property, and criminal behavior as the reasons. Victoria found out within hours, and his phone started buzzing nonstop with text after text, 37 messages in 1 hour according to the screenshots he sent me. She went from begging him to come home to threatening to destroy his career, to saying she'd kill herself, to calling him pathetic, to promising she'd change, to saying he'd never see Marcus again. Each message got saved and forwarded to his lawyer. The next morning, I finally sat down with a box of letters and found one labeled, "For my daughter on her wedding day," that I'd never opened. My hands shook as I read my mother's words about hoping I'd find someone who loved me the way Robert had loved her before she got sick, how she worried about leaving me alone and vulnerable, how she hoped I'd be protected and cherished. She'd been right to worry. Marcus secretly recording his own mom for weeks really makes me wonder what finally pushed him to start collecting evidence like that. Those USB files with Victoria laughing about destroying the letters must have been so hard for him to listen to while recording recording them secretly. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box, then noticed movement outside my window and jumped, heart racing. It looked like Victoria standing by the mailbox, but when Daniel checked, it was just our neighbor in a similar coat. This kept happening over the next few days, seeing her in store windows, in passing cars, in shadows across the yard, even though Daniel kept reminding me she had an ankle monitor and couldn't leave her house. The paranoia was exhausting, but I couldn't shake it. Then Grace called to tell me someone had posted the family reunion video on TikTok with the caption, "Woman reads dead mom's hidden letters at family reunion after evil stepmom hid them," and it had 3 million views already. The comments were full of people sharing their own stories about family members who'd erased deceased parents, destroyed photos, hidden letters, sold belongings without permission. Victoria's name was all over the comments since someone had identified her from the video and linked her arrest records. Her employer saw it and fired her immediately. 3 days later, Victoria's court-ordered psychological evaluation results came back showing narcissistic personality disorder with paranoid features and antisocial behavior patterns. Her lawyer tried to use this for an insanity defense, but the prosecutor pointed out that her actions showed careful planning and awareness of wrongdoing, like waiting until Robert was gone to destroy things and lying about what happened to them. Marcus called that night to say he couldn't afford his apartment without Victoria's help, since she'd been paying half his rent, so Rebecca offered to let him stay in her spare room. Robert felt terrible about Marcus struggling and went through Victoria's jewelry box, selling her diamond tennis bracelet and pearl necklace to set up a fund for Marcus's expenses. When he handed me the check to give to Marcus, he said my mother would have wanted us to help him since none of this was his fault. 2 days later, Aunt picked me up early in the morning and we drove to the cemetery with fresh flowers and a bag full of the photos Victoria had tried to destroy. We spent hours at my mother's grave, arranging the flowers and creating a small memorial with the recovered items, placing each photo carefully against the headstone and weighing them down with stones. Aunt held my hand as we stood there reclaiming this space that Victoria had tried to keep me from visiting all those years. The next week felt like drowning in slow motion when we got the notice that Victoria's trial was set for 3 months out. I went through the motions of work, cooking, sleeping, but everything felt suspended and unreal, like I was watching someone else live my life while I waited for the trial to start. I marked each day on the calendar with a black X, counting down. Then Victoria's lawyer contacted the prosecutor about a plea deal where she'd plead guilty in exchange for probation and mandatory counseling instead of jail time. The DA called me to ask what I thought, and I sat there with the phone in my hand, torn between wanting her punished for everything she'd done and just wanting this nightmare to be over so I could move on with my life. Before I could answer, Ellen showed up at the prosecutor's office with a manila envelope full of childhood photos showing Victoria's pattern going back decades, pictures of cut faces in family albums, burned letters in the fireplace, smashed heirlooms in the garbage, even a photo of young Victoria standing over a box of their grandmother's things with a lighter in her hand. Ellen sat down with the prosecutor and said Victoria had always been this way, but their family just made excuses, said she was troubled, said she needed understanding, said she'd grow out of it, but she never did, and now look where they all were. 2 days later, Robert showed up at my apartment without calling first, standing in my doorway with his shoulders slumped and his eyes red like he'd been crying for hours. He walked past me into the living room and sat down on my couch, putting his head in his hands and just shaking for a minute before he looked up at me. "I failed you," he said, his voice breaking. "I was so afraid of being alone that I let her hurt you. Your mother would never forgive me." We both started crying then, sitting there on opposite ends of the couch until he moved closer and hugged me for the first time in years. A real hug, not the quick, awkward ones we'd been doing. 3 days after that, the prosecutor called to tell me they were adding elder abuse charges because Ellen had given them boxes of evidence about what Victoria did to their mother before she died. Medical records showing unexplained injuries, bank statements with suspicious withdrawals, even a recording Ellen made secretly where Victoria was screaming at the old woman about changing her will. Victoria now faced up to 7 years in prison if they convicted her on everything, and the prosecutor said her case was getting stronger every day with all the evidence coming in. That weekend, Daniel made dinner at our place. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad, but afterward he got down on one knee right there in our kitchen while I was washing dishes. "I want to make new memories," he said, holding out a ring box, ones she can't touch. The ring was my mother's engagement ring that Aunt Caroline had kept safe all these years, and I said yes while soap suds dripped off my hands onto the floor. 2 days later, Marcus called me at 3 in the morning, his voice shaking so bad I could barely understand him at first. Victoria had taken a bunch of pills she'd been hoarding, timing it perfectly for when she knew Marcus would come home from his night shift at the hospital. He found her on the bathroom floor with the empty bottles arranged neatly beside her, and a note that just said, "You did this to me," in her perfect handwriting. The paramedics got there in time and pumped her stomach, but Marcus told me later while we sat in the hospital waiting room that he thought she wanted to be saved, that it was just another manipulation to make everyone feel guilty and maybe get sympathy from the jury. The hospital put her on a 72-hour psychiatric hold, and her lawyer immediately filed papers saying she wasn't competent to stand trial, that she needed mental health treatment, not prison. The prosecutor warned me this could delay everything for months while they did evaluations and fought about whether she was faking or really having a breakdown. I started having panic attacks about throwing anything away after that, keeping every receipt, every piece of paper, every plastic bag, because what if I needed it later? What if it was important and I lost it forever like the letters? Daniel found me one night sitting on the floor of our storage room surrounded by boxes of junk, crying because I couldn't decide what to keep and what to throw away. He sat down with me and helped me sort through everything piece by piece, understanding that this wasn't really about the stuff, but about the fear of losing more memories, more pieces of my past. 3 days later, Rebecca called to say she'd organized a memorial service for my mother, something we never got to do properly because Victoria rushed the funeral and kept it small. 40 people showed up at the church, people I hadn't seen in years, who all had stories about my mom that Victoria had tried to make us forget. Robert stood up and talked about his wife for the first time in 19 years, telling everyone how she used to sing in the shower and leave him funny notes in his lunch, and how she'd wanted to be a teacher before she got sick. 4 days after the memorial, the psychiatric evaluation came back saying Victoria was competent to stand planned trial, that her suicide attempt was what they called instrumental, which meant calculated to achieve a goal, not from genuine mental illness. The doctors testified that she'd been selective about what pills she took, choosing ones that would make her sick but not kill her, and that she'd shown manipulative behavior throughout her hospital stay, playing up symptoms when people were watching and acting normal when she thought she was alone. The judge set a new trial date for next month and denied her lawyer's request for another evaluation. I had to testify before the grand jury about everything. 20 years of her destroying things, hiding things, trying to erase my mother from existence. They asked me question after question for 3 hours while I told them about the photos, the letters, the jewelry, the books, everything she'd taken or destroyed or hidden. The grand jury came back with indictments on all counts, and Victoria's public defender immediately asked for another psychological evaluation, claiming the first one was biased. The judge denied it and said they needed to stop delaying and set a firm trial date. Grace testified as an expert witness about the psychological impact of what Victoria did, explaining to the jury how systematic emotional abuse and the destruction of a child's connection to a deceased parent causes lasting trauma. Victoria sat there watching with no expression on her face, but I could see her hands shaking in her lap, her fingers twisting her wedding ring around and around. The prosecutor stood up and asked Victoria if she wanted to reconsider the plea deal they'd offered earlier, 3 years in prison with 5 years probation and mandatory psychiatric treatment. Victoria's lawyer whispered in her ear for what felt like forever, while the whole courtroom waited. She finally nodded and said she'd take it. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later and reminded her she'd have no contact with any family members as part of the deal. It wasn't the 10 years we'd hoped for, but it was more than we expected her to get. 2 days after the plea deal, Robert called me over to his house to meet with his lawyer about changing his will. Victoria taking those pills right when Marcus would find her really shows how much she thinks ahead about getting reactions from people. Did she pick those exact pills on purpose to seem sick but stay safe? He signed papers that made sure everything that belonged to my mother would come directly to me, including her jewelry, the china set, and even her recipe box Victoria had hidden. The lawyer also drew up adoption papers for Marcus, since Robert wanted to make sure his inheritance was protected no matter what happened. Robert signed everything with steady hands and told me we were rebuilding this family the right way. That weekend, we went to the house to pack up Victoria's things for storage. The place felt different without her presence, like a weight had been lifted off the walls themselves. Marcus helped me carry boxes to the attic while Robert sat in his chair directing us where to put things. We found Victoria's collection of self-help books about dealing with difficult stepchildren, and Marcus threw them straight in the trash. He didn't keep a single thing of hers, not even the birthday cards she'd given him over the years. The sentencing day came faster than expected. Victoria stood in front of the judge wearing the same black dress she'd worn to my mother's funeral, which felt like another slap in the face. She read a statement blaming everyone but herself, claiming she only wanted to help us all move forward, and that we'd twisted her good intentions. The judge cut her off halfway through and told her that wanting to erase a woman from existence wasn't help, it was cruelty. He sentenced her to the full 3 years with no possibility of early release. 2 days later, they took Victoria to the state women's prison 3 hours away. Robert stayed home, but Marcus and I went to watch them lead her away in handcuffs. Marcus stood next to me on the courthouse steps and said he needed to see it end. We watched the van drive away, and neither of us said anything for a long time. That weekend, I finally did something Victoria had forbidden for years. I took my mother's ashes from the closet where Robert had hidden them and brought them to her old garden behind the house. Robert, Marcus, Caroline, and Daniel helped me spread them among the roses she'd planted when I was little. Caroline planted new flowers around the edges while Marcus dug holes for the bulbs my mother had loved. We worked in silence mostly, but when we finished, Caroline said my mother was finally home. The next week, I got access to the family Facebook page Victoria had controlled for years. I made myself the administrator and started adding back all the relatives she'd blocked over the years. Within hours, hundreds of photos and memories started flooding in from cousins and aunts who'd been shut out. People shared pictures of my mother I'd never seen, stories about her childhood, videos from family gatherings Victoria had deleted. My mother's digital presence came back to life photo by photo. Marcus came over that weekend with a box of old photo albums he'd found in the basement. We sat on my couch going through them page by page, him seeing most of the pictures for the first time. He pointed at a photo of my mother holding me as a baby and said she looked kind. I told him she was, and that he would have loved her. He asked me to tell him more stories about her, and we stayed up until 3 in the morning looking through every album. 3 days later, Ellen, Victoria's sister, filed a lawsuit against Victoria's estate for stealing their mother's inheritance years ago. She had bank statements and forged documents proving Victoria had taken over $200,000 meant for both sisters. The court immediately froze all of Victoria's hidden assets pending investigation. Ellen's lawyer said Victoria could face additional federal charges for elder abuse and fraud. Meanwhile, Robert's health started getting better without the daily stress. His doctor ran tests and said his blood pressure had dropped 20 points in just 2 weeks. Robert could walk to the mailbox without getting winded, and his hands stopped shaking. He told me peace was better medicine than anything they could prescribe. 3 months passed, and the nightmares wouldn't stop. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning and check every lock in the apartment twice, then check them again. Daniel would watch me from the bedroom doorway without saying anything, while I tested each window latch and rattled the deadbolt. My hands shook every time someone knocked on the door, even when I knew it was just the pizza delivery guy. I kept a baseball bat next to the bed and pepper spray in every room. Daniel never complained when I'd get up for the 3rd time in one night to make sure the front door was really locked. He'd just pull me back into bed after and hold me until my heart stopped racing. The therapist said this was normal after what happened and that healing takes time, but knowing that didn't make the fear go away. 3 days later, the whole family got together again at Aunt Caroline's house for what everyone called the Remembrance Reunion. People brought photo albums and old videos and stories about my mom that I'd never heard before. Marcus showed up with a box of her old recipes he'd found in Robert's attic. Grace brought a quilt my mom had started making when she was pregnant with me. Rebecca had tracked down my mom's college roommate who drove 6 hours just to tell me stories about their adventures. We set up tables in the backyard with all the photos spread out, and everyone took turns sharing memories. Nobody mentioned Victoria's name once, and her chair from the the last reunion stayed folded up in the garage. Robert looked 10 years younger as he told stories about meeting my mom at a bookstore and their first date at a terrible Italian restaurant. Marcus called me 3 days after that with news that made him sound happier than I'd heard him in years. He'd gotten into grad school with a full scholarship for their psychology program. He said he wrote his application essay about family trauma and recovery, and how watching our family deal with Victoria had inspired him to help other people escape toxic relationships. The admissions committee told him it was one of the most powerful essays they'd ever read. 2 days later, Robert called with news from Victoria's lawyer that she'd been put in solitary confinement after trying to manipulate her cellmate into smuggling letters out for her. The guards caught her trying to convince another inmate to contact me pretending to be a long-lost relative. Even locked up, she couldn't stop trying to control people. The warden said this was her third attempt at manipulation in 2 weeks. They moved her to a more secure unit with no contact with other prisoners. Robert and I spent the next afternoon at his lawyer's office setting up a scholarship fund in my mom's name for kids who'd lost a parent. We used some of the money from selling Victoria's jewelry collection that the court had awarded us. The lawyer helped us write the requirements so it would help kids like I'd been, dealing with grief while trying to stay in school. Within a week, we got our first application from a girl whose dad had died of cancer, and reading her letter made both of us cry in the middle of the coffee shop. 3 days later, Daniel and I got married in Robert's backyard, right where I'd read my mom's letters at that first reunion. We kept it small with just 20 people and no fancy decorations. I wore my mom's wedding dress that Aunt Caroline had kept hidden in her attic all these years. Instead of traditional vows, I read one of the letters my mom had written about hoping I'd find someone who loved me the way she loved my dad. Robert walked me down the aisle, and for once he didn't look away when things got emotional. Daniel's hands shook when he put the ring on my finger, but his voice stayed steady when he promised to always make me feel safe. Marcus stood up during the reception and gave a speech that made everyone stop eating. He talked about how I'd taught him that real family isn't about blood, but about choosing truth over comfortable lies. He said watching me stand up to Victoria had shown him what actual love looked like, not control dressed up as caring. He thanked me for being the sister he'd needed even when it meant losing the mother he'd known. Not once did he say Victoria's name. 3 days after the wedding, the district attorney called with news nobody expected. 4 other women had come forward after seeing the news coverage of Victoria's trial, saying she'd done similar things to them over the years. One was her college roommate, who said Victoria had stolen her identity to take out credit cards. Another was a coworker from 15 years ago, who Victoria had gaslight into thinking she was losing her mind. The prosecutor said with these new charges, Victoria could face up to 10 years instead of 3. The other women wanted to testify at a new trial, and the judge had already approved adding the charges. 2 days later, I sat in the courtroom while Ellen and 3 other women told their stories about Victoria's patterns going back 40 years. Ellen described how Victoria had isolated her from her family and convinced her she was too stupid to manage her own money. Another woman sobbed while explaining how Victoria had befriended her after her husband died, then slowly took control of her finances and tried to get power of attorney. The prosecutor showed a pattern of Victoria targeting vulnerable women and systematically destroying their support systems. Victoria sat at the defendant's table with her jaw clenched and her hands folded, but everyone could see her mask had finally cracked completely. 3 days after that, her lawyer delivered a letter from Victoria that he said was an apology, but I recognized the manipulation before I even opened it. I took it out to my mom's garden behind Robert's house where we'd planted roses after the trial. Without reading a single word, I held my lighter to the corner and watched it burn. Some words don't deserve to be heard, and some people don't deserve forgiveness. Victoria trying to control people even from prison by getting her cellmate to smuggle letters really makes me wonder what goes through someone's mind when they just can't stop manipulating others, no matter what. The ashes floated away on the wind while I watered the roses that were finally starting to bloom. 2 weeks later, I got the call from the prosecutor that Victoria had decided to plead guilty to all the charges instead of going to trial. The courtroom was packed when we went for the sentencing hearing, and I watched her stand there in her orange jumpsuit looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. The judge took his time reading through all the charges, including fraud, theft, destruction of property, harassment, and emotional abuse of minors. When he finally got to the sentence, he looked right at her and said she was a systematic destroyer of families who'd shown no remorse for her actions. 10 years total with no chance of early release for at least 5 years. She didn't even look at us when they led her away in handcuffs. 2 days after that, we held a celebration of life for my mom on what would have been her 60th birthday at the community center downtown. Over 100 people showed up, including relatives I hadn't seen in years, and friends from her old job who still remembered her. Robert stood up at the microphone, and for the first time in over 20 years, he talked about their love story without looking over his shoulder or lowering his voice. He told everyone about their first date at the ice cream shop on Main Street and how she'd gotten chocolate sauce on her nose and laughed so hard she snorted. He talked about their wedding day and how she'd insisted on dancing to every single song even after her feet hurt. He talked about the day I was born and how she'd held me for 6 hours straight, refusing to put me down because she said I was too perfect. By the end, everyone was crying, but it felt good, like we were finally washing away years of silence. That week, I started volunteering at the support group for adult children of narcissistic parents that met at the library every Tuesday night. The first time I shared my story, my hands were shaking so bad I had to sit on them, but people nodded and understood in ways that made me feel less alone. One woman said hearing about the letters helped her realize her own mother had been hiding things from her dead father's family. Another man said my story gave him courage to finally cut contact with his toxic stepfather. Every week, more people came, and we built this little community of survivors, helping each other see the patterns we'd been too close to recognize. Marcus came to me the next week with legal papers and a huge smile on his face. He'd officially changed his last name from Williams to Robert's maiden name Sullivan, cutting the last tie to Victoria. He said he got to choose who his family was, and he was choosing us. We all went out for pizza to celebrate, and for the first time in years, we felt like a real family sitting around that table covered in red checkered plastic. Robert put his house on the market that weekend, saying there were too many ghosts in those walls, and he wanted to start fresh. We spent 3 days packing up everything worth keeping, while Victoria's stuff went straight into a storage unit that the court would would deal with. He found a nice little condo near Rebecca's apartment with a balcony where he could grow tomatoes and no memories lurking in every corner. The morning I found out I was pregnant, I just sat on the bathroom floor staring at the test for 20 minutes. Daniel found me there, and when I showed him the stick, he picked me up and spun me around so fast I thought I might throw up for real this time. We decided right away that if it was a girl, we'd name her after my mom, because the cycle of erasing women from our family was ending with us. A package arrived at my door the next week with no return address, just a Cedar Rapids postmark. Inside was a shoebox full of photos I'd never seen before from someone who'd known my mom in college. There were pictures of her at 19 laughing at a party with her hair in braids, and pictures of her studying in the library with her glasses sliding down her nose. At the bottom was a letter she'd written to her friend about wanting to be a mom someday, and how she hoped her kids would know how much they were wanted even before they existed. The woman who sent them said she'd seen the news articles about Victoria's arrest and thought I deserved to have these pieces of my mom back. 5 days later, we all drove out to the cemetery together for the first time since the trial ended. My belly was just starting to show under my sweater, and I pressed my hand against it as I knelt by my mom's headstone. I pulled out the last letter she'd written me before she died, the one about wedding days and grandchildren and all the moments she'd miss. My voice only shook a little as I read it out loud to her, and when I got to the end, I put my hand on the cold granite and told her she was going to be a grandmother. Marcus stood beside me with his hand on my shoulder, while Daniel held my other hand, and Robert sat on the bench with Caroline, both of them crying quietly. We stayed there until the sun started setting, and the cemetery worker came to tell us they were closing soon. As we walked back to the car, I looked back one more time at her headstone surrounded by the roses we'd planted, and thought about how Victoria had tried so hard to erase her from our lives. She'd burned the letters and hidden the photos and forbidden us from speaking her name, but here we were anyway, carrying her memory forward into the next generation. The letters might be gone, but her words lived in us now, passed down through stories and memories and the love she'd planted that even Victoria couldn't kill. My mom was more alive in our hearts than she'd been in 20 years, and Victoria was locked in a cell where she couldn't hurt anyone else. She wanted to erase my mother, but instead she'd made her eternal. I can't stop wondering what was going through everyone's heads during those 20 minutes on the bathroom floor. Pregnancy tests have this way of just making time stand still.